Look at that tyre, completely flat. James Hunt finishing third and almost catching Patrick Depay. And James Hunt is the world champion.
And can I just finally ask you, what are your immediate plans now?
I should be getting drunk.
My life is worth more than a title. Those were the words spoken by the defending world champion Niki Lauda as he handed James Hunt his first and only world championship at the Mount Fuji circuit in one of the most dramatic title-deciding races in the entire history of Formula One. From near-fatal crashes to miraculous comebacks, torrential rain chaos, and a decision that sparked debates for decades, this race had absolutely everything. The 1976 season had been nothing short of extraordinary. A year of political warfare, technical innovation, and enough drama to fill a Hollywood screenplay, which it eventually did, and at the center of it all was the rivalry between Niki Lauda and James Hunt that had captivated audiences around the world. These two drivers could not have been more different. Lauda was the calculating, methodical Austrian, nicknamed the Computer for his precise approach to racing. He had fought his way into Formula One, taking out bank loans against his own life insurance just to fund his early career when his wealthy family refused to support what they saw as a frivolous pursuit. Hunt, on the other hand, was the flamboyant British playboy whose aggressive style and larger-than-life personality made him a fan favorite, the man who had earned the nickname Hunt the Shunt for his spectacular crashes in his early career. They were friends off the track, often sharing hotels and even flying together to races, but once the helmets went on, they were fierce competitors. The season had been marred by controversy from the start. Hunt had been disqualified from the Spanish Grand Prix, then reinstated on appeal. Months later, the British Grand Prix saw his win stripped after a first lap restart controversy that had Ferrari and other teams protesting. Ferrari even boycotted the Austrian Grand Prix in protest over other perceived injustices. The political battles between the teams and the governing body added another layer to what was already an intense championship fight. Heading into the finale, Lauda held a slender 3-point lead over Hunt with 68 points to 65. The mathematics were simple, but the circumstances were anything but. You see, just 3 months earlier at the Nürburgring on August 1st, Lauda had experienced one of the most horrific crashes in Formula One history, a crash that would forever change the sport. The old Nürburgring was 14 miles of pure danger, a track so treacherous that Jackie Stewart had nicknamed it the Green Hell. Lauda himself had been so concerned about the safety conditions that he tried to organize a driver boycott before the race, citing the lack of fire marshals and safety equipment, but the vote went against him by just a single margin and the race went ahead. On the second lap of the German Grand Prix, as Lauda pushed hard through the fast left kink before Bergwerk, his Ferrari 312 T2 suddenly snapped to the right and launched itself into an earth embankment. The car bounced back onto the track completely engulfed in flames and was struck first by Brett Lunger, then by Harold Ertl. Fellow drivers Arturo Merzario, Guy Edwards, Ertl, and Lunger rushed to the scene. Merzario managed to undo Lauda's seatbelts, and together they dragged the Austrian from the inferno, but the damage was beyond devastating. He had sustained severe burns to his head and face. His hands were badly burned, his lungs were scorched from inhaling toxic fumes from the burning car, and the exposure time to the flames had been catastrophic. A priest was summoned to the hospital to administer the last rites, as doctors gave him little chance of surviving the night. And yet, just 6 weeks later at the Italian Grand Prix, Lauda did the unthinkable. He climbed back into a Ferrari with bandages still seeping blood, his face barely healed, and his custom helmet modified to accommodate his wounds when he arrived at Fiorano for testing before the race. Even Enzo Ferrari could not believe what he was seeing, a ghost walking back into the paddock. Lauda finished 4th at Monza in what can only be described as one of the most courageous comebacks in the history of any sport. Jackie Stewart called it exactly that, and Ferrari team manager Daniele Audetto later said he would never forget the sight of Lauda arriving that weekend 40 days after he had seen him being loaded into a helicopter fighting for his life. But that crash had cost him dearly, not just physically, but in the championship standings in his absence. Hunt had clawed back huge points winning Germany, then later, the Dutch Grand Prix Canada and Watkins Glen, turning a comfortable Ferrari title lead into a razor-thin fight. The momentum had completely shifted in Hunt's favor. And here's the part most fans forget. In 1976, not every result counted. Formula One used a dropped scores system, which made the title math even more confusing in real time. As the paddock arrived at Mount Fuji, the gap was just 3 points with everything to play for. Qualifying at Fuji proved that Hunt meant business, but the pole went to Mario Andretti in the Lotus 77, with the American putting together a brilliant lap on a circuit that nobody in the Formula One paddock had ever raced on before. Hunt lined up second on the grid, a mere fraction behind, while Lauda found himself in third, the Austrian, knowing that he simply needed to finish within 3 points of Hunt to retain his crown. Then came John Watson in the Penske Jody Scheckter, in the six-wheeled Tyrrell Carlos Pace in the Brabham Alpha Clay Regazzoni in the second Ferrari, and Vittorio Brambilla in the March, completing the top 8 positions. The race also marked several significant debuts for Japanese Motorsport Heroes Racing. Entered an old Tyrrell 007 for Kazuyoshi Hoshino on Bridgestone tires, which was the first ever Formula One start for the Japanese manufacturer, a manufacturer that would go on to dominate the sport decades later. Kojima Engineering entered a locally built chassis, the KE007 for Masahiro Hasemi, running on Dunlop rubber, a car built by former Suzuki motocross rider Matsuhisa Kojima, right next to the Fuji circuit itself. Noritake Takahara rented the second Surtees to make his World Championship debut in front of his home crowd. Meanwhile, Tony Trimmer attempted to qualify the resurrected Mackie, but failed to make the grid. Interestingly, McLaren had a small advantage heading into the weekend. Team manager Alistair Caldwell had managed to hire the Fuji circuit for an exclusive test session in the gap between the penultimate race and the finale. The gearbox seized after just a few laps, cutting the test short, but McLaren were still the only team to have any experience at all of the track they were about to race on. Race day arrived, and with it came the kind of weather that would define this event. October 24th, 1976, the heavens opened overnight, and by morning, Fuji Speedway was drenched in torrential rain, with fog rolling down from Mount Fuji itself, that iconic snow-capped peak that loomed over the circuit, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts majestic, and menacing streams of water ran across the track. In several places, visibility was measured in meters, not hundreds of meters. It was apocalyptic. The start was delayed for hours because the rain was so intense, but the pressure to race was massive. There were intense debates in the paddock as to whether the race should even start at all, but this was no ordinary Grand Prix. This was the first time a Formula One race was being broadcast live on television around the world. Bernie Ecclestone had brokered the deal, and the Japanese organizers had paid handsomely for the privilege. They had also been squeezed for an extra $138,000 just months before, when the constructors threatened to boycott. Adjusted for inflation, that was nearly $800,000. The pressure to deliver was immense, and calling off the race was simply not an option. In the end, the organizers decided to proceed, and most drivers voted to race, though some were distinctly unhappy about it. The conditions were at the very limit of what could be considered safe, and several voices in the paddock openly questioned whether they should be racing at all. Lauda was among those who questioned the decision, and considering what he had been through just weeks earlier, who could blame him? The fire had damaged his eyelids and tear ducts. He couldn't blink normally in heavy spray. His vision would collapse faster than anyone else's. The irony was cruel. The same rain that was causing problems for everyone was going to cause far worse problems for a man whose face had been burned off just 3 months prior. When the lights went out, Hunt got away brilliantly, his McLaren M23 surging into the lead immediately with Watson and Andretti in pursuit behind them. The spray was so thick that drivers could barely see the car in front of them. It was like driving blind at 150 miles an hour, conditions that would test even the bravest of racers to their absolute limits. On the second lap, Watson slid down an escape road and dropped out of contention, and then came the moment that changed everything, the moment that would be debated for decades to come, until suddenly Lauda pulled into the pits, climbed out of his perfectly healthy Ferrari, and withdrew from the race. To the watching world, it was a shock. Here was the defending champion, the man who had come back from near death just weeks earlier, walking away from the fight with the championship on the line. But Lauda had made his calculation, and he had made it coldly, rationally, and with the same precise logic that had earned him his nickname. He later explained his reasoning with characteristic bluntness to a swarm of reporters who surrounded him, asking a single word. Far of fear, he elaborated that his life was worth more than a title, having already cheated death. Once that season, he was not prepared to roll those dice again in conditions he deemed suicidal. It was a decision that would be debated for years to come. Was it cowardice, or was it the bravest thing a racing driver could do, to know when to walk away, to recognize that some risks were simply not worth taking? Hunt was now in control of his own destiny. He simply had to finish fourth or better to become world champion. But this race was far from over. Larry Perkins also withdrew after a single lap, citing the conditions as too dangerous. Carlos Pache and Emerson Fittipaldi would follow suit later in the race, but most of the field pressed on through the deluge. As Hunt maintained his lead at the front, the battle behind him was chaotic. Second place changed hands multiple times between Andretti and Vittorio Brambilla. The Italian was quick in the wet, having won the previous year's Austrian Grand Prix in similar conditions, and on lap 22, he made a bold challenge for the lead itself. Brambilla dove down the inside of Hunt, but the move went wrong and he spun out of contention. He would continue for a while longer before electrical problems ended his race 15 laps later. Just like there is no halt in the content I am bringing to you, so if you are enjoying it, make sure you subscribe, will you? Meanwhile, Jochen Mass moved up to second, giving McLaren a potential 1-2 finish. But then on lap 36, he lost control and crashed just before turn 7 that promoted Patrick Depailler into second, with Andretti third. Hunt was still leading and looking comfortable, but the conditions were about to turn against him. And that's when everything flipped. As the race progressed, something strange happened, the rain began to ease, and the track started to dry. This should have been good news, but for Hunt, it spelled disaster. His wet weather tires, which had been perfect in the rain, were now overheating on the drying track. McLaren team manager Alistair Caldwell put out pit boards telling Hunt to cool his tires by seeking out the wet sections of the track to keep the rubber from degrading. Mass had understood immediately and was splashing through puddles to preserve his tires before his crash, but Hunt was not reacting to the signals. On lap 62, Depailler and Andretti both swept past the struggling McLaren. Hunt was now third, but given Lauda's withdrawal, he only needed fourth place to win the title, so he was still in a strong position, or so it seemed. But then disaster struck 2 laps later. Depailler's left rear tire started to deflate and he was forced to pit. Andretti inherited the lead, but then Hunt suffered the same fate, his tires worn down to the air. As Caldwell later described it, he limped around half a lap on punctured rubber and dragged his car into the pits. What followed was chaos. McLaren's jacks at the time were not designed to lift a car with punctures at both the front and rear. One of the mechanics, Howard Moore, physically lifted the front of the car with his bare hands while the team scrambled to change the tires. It was a desperately slow stop, and when Hunt finally rejoined, he found himself down in 5th place. There were just 4 laps remaining, and he was 2 positions away from where he needed to be for the championship. The tension was unbearable. For 2 agonizing laps, Hunt could not make any progress. He was stuck behind Depailler, Alan Jones, and Clay Regazzoni. The dreams seemed to be slipping away with every passing second. But then with 2 laps remaining, everything changed. Depailler, who had rejoined after his own stop, made his move, overtaking both Jones and Regazzoni, whose tires were also degrading badly. Hunt saw his opportunity, and on the very next lap, with everything on the line, he produced one of the great overtakes in championship history, sweeping past both Jones and Regazzoni on the long Fuji straight, using every bit of power the Cosworth engine could give him. When he crossed the line, he had absolutely no idea what position he was in. Such was the confusion of the race with the spray, the multiple pit stops, and the constant position changes that even the timing systems were struggling to keep up. Even the fastest lap was initially announced wrong before it was corrected. Days later, the unofficial results initially showed Hunt in 5th place, which would have meant Lauda retained the championship by a single point. The cruelest of margins after everything that had happened. Hunt climbed out of his car, furious and confused, sweat and rain mixing on his face. He did not know he had done it. Photographs from the moment show him remonstrating angrily with his team, certain that the title had slipped through his fingers. At the final moment back in England, his family was watching the live broadcast at 3 in the morning, holding their breath. But after quick deliberation, the official result confirmed what had actually happened. James Hunt had finished 3rd behind Andretti and Depailler. He was the 1976 world champion. Mario Andretti took the victory, his 2nd in Formula 1, coming over 5 years after his maiden win at the 1971 South African Grand Prix. To this day, it remains one of the longest gaps between a 1st and 2nd win in the sport's history. Depailler claimed 2nd for Tyrrell, with Hunt 3rd, securing the 4 points he needed to beat Lauda by just a single point. It was a championship decided by a single point, one of the closest title finishes in Formula One history, and it capped off what many still consider the greatest season in Formula One history. A season that had everything from controversies and disqualifications to political battles, a near-fatal crash, a miraculous comeback, and a title decided in the most dramatic circumstances imaginable, the stuff that Hollywood dreams of. The story of Hunt and Lauda at Fuji 1976 became so iconic that it was indeed immortalized in the 2013 film Rush, directed by Ron Howard. With Chris Hemsworth as Hunt and Daniel Bruhl as Lauda, the film introduced a whole new generation to this incredible rivalry, and Lauda himself made a cameo appearance, giving his stamp of approval to the portrayal. But this race also had lasting consequences for Formula One. It proved the pulling power of a dramatic title showdown and helped establish the commercial model that Bernie Ecclestone would build upon for decades. The live television broadcast was a success and changed the way the sport was consumed forever. As for Lauda, his decision to withdraw damaged his relationship with Ferrari, who were furious that he had given away the championship, but he returned the following year hungrier than ever and reclaimed the title from Hunt. With 2 races to spare, he would go on to win a 3rd championship with McLaren in 1984, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest drivers of all time. Hunt, meanwhile, never won another championship. 1976 would be his only title, and he retired from the sport in 1979. But his legend only grew with time, the playboy who became world champion in the most dramatic fashion possible. So not only was Fuji 1976 one of the greatest races ever staged, but it also had huge implications for the sport as a whole. I quite doubt we will ever see a championship decided in such dramatic fashion again. But that's what makes this race so special. It was a once-in-a-generation moment captured live on television for the first time. And as for Lauda's decision that day, the one that cost him a championship but may have saved his life, he never regretted it because, as he said, "My life is worth more than a title." But the story doesn't end there, because what happened after the checkered flag at Fuji might be just as fascinating as the race itself. You see, when Hunt finally realized he had won the championship, the celebrations were anything but ordinary. The British driver, who had spent the entire race thinking he had lost everything, suddenly found himself mobbed by journalists, team members, and fans in the paddock. But Hunt, being Hunt, did not exactly handle victory with grace. He was furious, absolutely livid with his team for what he perceived as poor communication during the race. The pit boards, the signals, the confusion about his position, all of it had left him thinking he had thrown away his life's dream in the final laps. So when he discovered he had actually won, his first reaction was not joy, it was anger. He reportedly shouted at Alistair Caldwell in the pits, demanding to know why nobody had told him what was going on. Caldwell later recalled that managing Hunt that day was like trying to control a tornado. The man was brilliant behind the wheel, but impossible to handle when things got stressful, and Fuji had been nothing but stress from start to finish. The post-race celebrations eventually turned into something more fitting for a world champion. Hunt partied like only James Hunt could party. The stories from that night in Japan became legendary in the paddock, involving copious amounts of champagne, questionable decisions, and behavior that would make modern-day sponsors run for the hills. But that was Hunt. He raced hard, he played hard, and he made no apologies for either. Meanwhile, in the Ferrari garage, the atmosphere could not have been more different. Enzo Ferrari was not a man known for forgiveness, and Lauda's decision to withdraw had left the old man seething. The relationship between driver and team principal had already been strained after Ferrari hired Carlos Reutemann to replace Lauda. While he was still fighting for his life in hospital now with the championship loss, Ferrari felt betrayed. The tension would continue into 1977, and despite Lauda winning the title that year, he left Ferrari at the end of the season in circumstances that were far from amicable. The partnership that had produced 2 world championships ended with bitterness and recrimination, a far cry from the triumphant homecoming that should have followed such success. But here is where the story takes an even more interesting turn, because the friendship between Hunt and Lauda, the 2 men who had battled so fiercely for that 1976 title, only grew stronger in the years that followed. On the surface, they seemed like opposites. Hunt was the wild child, the party animal, the man who famously said, "I smoke, I drink, and I am world champion." Lauda was the calculating professional, the man who approached racing like a business transaction rather than a romantic adventure, yet beneath those differences they shared something deeper. A mutual respect that only competitors who have pushed each other to the absolute limit can truly understand. Lauda once said that Hunt was one of the very few people in racing that he genuinely liked. Not just respected, but actually liked. They would often find themselves at the same events in the years after their retirement, swapping stories, laughing about the old days, and maintaining a friendship that transcended their rivalry. When Hunt died suddenly of a heart attack in 1993 at just 45 years old, Lauda was devastated. He told reporters that he was sad, but not surprised. Hunt had lived life at full throttle in everything he did, and that intensity had taken its toll. The years of smoking, drinking, and burning the candle at both ends had caught up with him. Lauda attended the funeral and spoke movingly about his friend, describing him as the only person he had ever envied. Think about that for a moment. Here was a three-time world champion, a man who had survived being burned alive and come back to win again, a man who built airlines and business empires, and the person he envied was James Hunt. Perhaps it was because Hunt had something Lauda never quite managed to capture, that effortless charisma, that ability to make everyone around him feel like they were part of something special. Hunt walked into a room and became the center of attention, not because he demanded it, but because people were drawn to him like moths to a flame. Lauda, on the other hand, always felt like an outsider. Even when he was winning, he was too honest, too blunt, too unwilling to play the political games that the sport demanded. He rubbed people the wrong way, and he knew it. But he also knew he was right about most things, and that was what mattered to him. The 1976 season changed both men in ways that went far beyond the championship trophy for Hunt. It was the peak of his career, but also in some ways the beginning of the end. The pressure of being world champion weighed on him. The expectation, the scrutiny, the demands. He never quite recaptured the magic of that title-winning season, and within 3 years he had walked away from the sport entirely. For Lauda, the near-death experience at the Nürburgring gave him a perspective that most people never gain. He understood in a visceral way that racing was not worth dying for, that there were limits to the risks a rational person should take. That decision at Fuji, the one that cost him the championship, was a direct result of that new understanding. Some called him a coward, others called him wise, but Lauda did not care what anyone thought. He had looked death in the face and survived. He was not going to tempt fate twice in the same season just to win a trophy. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of Fuji 1976. Two men, two philosophies, two completely different approaches to life. And yet both of them found what they were looking for. Hunt got his championship, the validation he craved, the proof that he belonged among the greats. Lauda got something more valuable. He got to live. The Austrian would go on to have a remarkable life after racing building Lauda Air, surviving another near tragedy when one of his planes crashed in 1991, and eventually returning to Formula One as a team executive, helping to build the Mercedes dynasty that would dominate the sport in the 2000s. He wore his red cap everywhere he went, a constant reminder of the scars beneath, and he never stopped speaking his mind until his death in 2019. Hunt became a beloved television commentator, his wit and insight bringing Formula One to a whole new audience in Britain. His partnership with Murray Walker became the soundtrack of a generation of racing fans, and even though his personal life remained turbulent, his legacy in the sport only grew with each passing year. The 1976 Japanese Grand Prix was supposed to decide a championship, and it did, but it also decided something far more profound. It showed the world that there are different ways to win, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. Fuji Speedway would host Formula One again the following year, but tragedy struck when a crash involving Gilles Villeneuve killed 2 spectators. The circuit was removed from the calendar, and Formula One would not return to Japan until 1987 when Suzuka became the new home of the Japanese Grand Prix. The 1976 race remains frozen in time, a perfect capsule of an era when racing was more dangerous, more unpredictable, and more human than it would ever be again. That being said, if you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out the one I made about another legendary wet weather race? Something tells me you'll like that one.